You see, most people lose authority before the interaction even begins. And it's not because they're rejected, it's because they enter incorrectly. They enter like a guest, or worse, like an interruption. You need to understand something clearly. The way you enter determines whether you are evaluated as noise or as relevance. Most people enter with one of two signals: apology or performance. They say things like, "Sorry to bother you, I know you're busy, do you have a quick second?" And this sounds polite, but it tells the other person, my presence requires your permission. And once you lower yourself to that level, you must now earn your way back up to the top. Authority does not enter aggressively either, but it does not enter apologetically. It enters neutrally, calm, direct, contained. The purpose of entry is not to create interest, it's to test relevance. That's it. You're not there to convince someone to care. You are there to determine whether continuation is justified. If you enter with that posture internally, your language will change automatically. You will not over-explain. You will not overframe. You will not add extra context to make yourself feel safer. You state why you're there briefly and you stop. That pause matters because the moment after your first sentence determines the tone of the interaction. If you keep talking, you're chasing acceptance. And if you stop, you're transferring responsibility. Most people are uncomfortable with that transfer. They're going to feel the tension. They rush to fill it. And in doing so, they reveal need. Now, need shifts power. Here's the rule. Entry should do one thing only: establish whether this is worth continuing or not. Not evaluating whether they like you, not whether they're impressed, not whether they're engaged, just whether continuation makes sense. That requires brevity. It requires stillness. And it requires the willingness to exit immediately if alignment doesn't exist. And this is where ego gets involved. People think if I just explain a bit more, they'll understand. No. If they need more explanation at entry, then your interaction has already been misaligned from the beginning. Entry is a filter, not a pitch. Now let's talk about your emotional neutrality. When you enter, your energy must communicate that if this makes sense, we'll move forward. If it doesn't, we won't. There's no pressure in that tone. There's no push. There's no attachment. And because there's no attachment, there is less resistance. Because resistance increases when someone senses they're being pulled one way or the other. When you are neutral, they don't feel pulled. They feel invited to evaluate. And evaluate is safer than persuasion. See, most amateurs try to collapse that evaluation way too quickly. They jump right into explanation, they stack value, they build momentum. That's not a strength, that's anxiety disguised as enthusiasm. You see, real strength at entry is restraint. Short, clear, stop. If continuation exists, it will always reveal itself. If it doesn't, you leave. No resentment, no frustration, no second attempts to save it. But your job at entry is not to make something happen. It is determine whether something is even possible to happen. That distinction changes everything. A gatekeeper does not have real authority. They have what is called borrowed authority. And most people cannot tell the difference. A gatekeeper controls access. They do not control outcomes. They are responsible for filtering interruptions, but they are not responsible for strategic decisions. But when you treat them like a decision maker, you're elevating their status unnecessarily. And when you argue with them, you're actually collapsing your own frame. Let's clarify something immediately. Gatekeeper resistance is not rejection. It is just the process. It is habit. It is a protection of time. If someone says he's not available, or you'll have to email, or we don't take walk-ins, that is not personal, it's procedural. The mistake most people make is emotional interpretation of that. They hear resistance and assume disinterest. So they compensate. They explain more, they justify their importance, they attempt to persuade the gatekeeper. That is utter failure. Your job in a gatekeeper interaction is simple. Determine whether access is structurally possible. That's it. Not to convince the gatekeeper of your value, not to pitch, not to educate. Access or exit. Now let's talk about borrowed authority. Gatekeepers speak with confidence because they represent someone else's time. But confidence is not ownership. Ownership belongs to the decision maker. And if you start negotiating with someone who does not own the decision, you're just wasting your time. You get one escalation test. One. You clarify whether transition is possible. If it is, you move. If it is not, you exit. Anything beyond that just becomes ego protection. See, most amateurs get stuck in loops. They try different angles, different explanations, different framings. But the moment you push more than twice, you are no longer testing the process. You're just challenging authority. And that challenge triggers defense. Once defense is triggered, you lose all leverage. Here's the discipline. You respect the role, you do not submit to it. You acknowledge the process, but you do not overstate importance. You remain neutral. The neutrality is critical. If you sound frustrated, they're going to close the door harder. If you sound overly polite, they're going to categorize you as low priority. If you sound pushy, they will shut you down so quickly. But if you sound structured, calm, and non-attached, something different happens. They don't feel threatened anymore. They don't feel pressured. They simply evaluate whether your escalation makes sense. And that's all you need. And if it doesn't make sense, you leave. No sarcasm, no tension, no, okay, fine. Just resolution. Now, sometimes leaving cleanly creates more leverage than pushing because most people push. And when you don't push, you are remembered differently. And sometimes access opens later, not because you persuaded them, but because you didn't resist the structure. Gatekeeper discipline is emotional discipline. You are not here to win access. You are there to test whether access exists. If it does, you transition. If it doesn't, you exit. That is control. Managers are not gatekeepers, but they're not decision makers either. They sit in between. And that in between position is where most people end up losing weeks. You see, a manager has influence. They may have input. They may even have operational authority, but they do not carry that final risk. And risk ownership is what defines real power. If someone does not carry final risk, they cannot produce final decisions. And that distinction must stay clear in your mind at all times. Because if you forget it, you will begin treating partial authority as full authority. And that creates false momentum. You see, false momentum feels productive. You're talking to someone with a title. They ask questions, they give feedback, they seem engaged, and you feel like something is happening. But ask yourself, can this person say yes without asking someone else? Can they commit resources without approval? Can they end the conversation permanently? And if the answer is no to any one of those questions, you are not in a decision state. You are in a filtering state. You see, the mistake most people make here is over investment. They start educating, presenting, they start building alignment, and they try to win over the manager. But winning over the manager does not equal winning access. It equals winning approval. And approval is not ownership. Look, managers are not enemies. They are part of the process. But that process must be tested quickly. Your job in this state is not to persuade. It is to determine, is this person a bridge or an absorber? You see, a bridge connects you upward, but an absorber keeps you occupied. Absorbers ask for information, they request decks, they want details, then they'll say, I'll run it up the chain. And if you comply with that structure, you enter a loop. And loops drain your leverage because the longer you stay in partial authority, the more attached you become. And attachment changes your tone. You start following up, you start nudging, you start asking for updates, and now you're chasing someone who never owned the decision in the first place. That is a structural failure. Here's the discipline. You get one escalation test. 1. You clarify whether upward movement is possible. If escalation is viable, you move. If escalation is vague, you exit. Not because you're impatient, but because you protect your structure. Now here's something subtle. When you stay too long with partial authority, the decision maker above senses it. They see you as someone who never pushed for clarity, and that lowers your perceived value. Decision makers respect people who seek resolution. They do not respect people who linger in mid-level loops. Managers often sound confident, helpful, but confidence without ownership is a trap. Ownership is what matters. You have to ask yourself internally, who carries the risk here? Who could say yes? Who could say no? If the answer isn't clear, you are not in the decision state. And if you're not in the decision state, your job is escalation or exit. Nothing else. Managers are not obstacles, and they are not endpoints. Treat them accordingly. Access is not something you work towards. It is something you resolve. See, most people treat access like it's a negotiation. They chip away, they soften, they build familiarity. They hope access grows over time. That is not structure. That is drift. And by the time you reach this point, whether it's with a gatekeeper, a manager, or an initial contact, one question must be answered. Is upward movement possible? If yes, you transition. If no, terminate. There is no third path. The mistake most people make is emotional hesitation. They sense access isn't happening, but they don't want to end the interaction. So they leave it loose. They say, okay, I'll follow up. Maybe we can revisit. Let me send something. See, that feels productive, but it creates ambiguity. And your ambiguity removes removes all leverage, and leverage is built on clarity. Now, let's define resolution clearly. Resolution means you leave knowing exactly what happened. Not hoping, not assuming, knowing. If access is viable, it becomes structured. There's a defined next movement, a named person, a time-bound action, a clear escalation. If access is not viable, you close the loop. Not emotionally or defensively, not with visible frustration, just cleanly close the loop. You see, here's what most people fear. They fear that ending access premature kills opportunity. But here's what actually kills your opportunity: lingering without authority. When you linger, you signal that you need continuation more than clarity. And that shifts the power. Resolution preserves power. Now let's address your ego. Sometimes you will believe, I'll just try one more angle. And that thought right there is pure attachment. Attachment then leaks into your tone, and when attachment leaks, people feel it, and then they end up resisting. The discipline here is simple. One escalation test. If it moves, move. If it stalls, end. This is not about impatience. It's about respecting the structure. Structure reduces emotional volatility. You don't carry interactions around in your head. You don't replay them. You don't overthink follow-ups because they were resolved. Resolution creates your psychological freedom, and psychological freedom creates better posture in the next interaction. Here's another benefit. When you exit cleanly, you change perception. Not every action is meant to produce a decision, but every interaction must reveal whether a decision is even possible. You see, a non-decision interaction feels productive, and that's what makes it dangerous. There are questions, there's engagement, there's a discussion, there's energy, but there is no ownership, no risk, no resolution. And if you can't detect that early, you're going to waste time politely. Let's define that clearly. A non-decision interaction is one where no one present can commit. No one present carries risk, and no one present is accountable for the outcome. If those conditions exist, you are not in a decision environment. You are in a processing environment. And processing environments gather information. They do not produce outcomes. That distinction must be clear in your mind at all times. And here's what makes this subtle. Non-decision interactions often feel intelligent. You discuss strategy, you explore the hypotheticals, you play the what if game, and you might even receive some compliments. And that emotional feedback tricks you into thinking, this is going well. But then you have to ask yourself, is anyone here able to say yes? Is anyone here able to say no? If the answer is unclear, you are drifting. Now, here are the early warning signs when something is a non-decision environment. First, you have some vague ownership. Phrases like, we have to run it by leadership, or we need to review internally, or I'll pass this along. Notice what's missing inside of that. A name, a timeline, a decision path, all three. Secondly, endless clarification. So they keep asking questions, but they never define those next steps. See, questions alone are not progress, but structure is progress. Third, is no friction. And this one surprises people. If there is no tension at all, no fork in the road, no narrowing of the options, you are likely in exploration, not any sort of resolution. See, real decisions create a slight pressure. And if that pressure never appears, decisions are not in the scope. Now understand this. Non-decision interactions are not necessarily bad. They just must be identified quickly. Because once you recognize them, your job changes. You are no longer building an alignment. You are testing the escalation. And if escalation is possible, you move upward. If escalation is not possible, you close the loop. You see, most amateurs try to build the case in non-decision environments. They think, if I just explain it well enough, they'll advocate for me. Maybe, but that is a weak path. Because if you are just relying on someone else's conviction to move your opportunity, authority, because you are relying on someone else's conviction to move your opportunity. See, authority does not outsource conviction. Authority seeks ownership. Now, here's the internal questions that you must ask early. Who owns the risk here? Not who is talking, not who is leading the meeting, but who owns the actual outcome? If you cannot identify that person clearly, you are not in the right state. And once you know that, your posture changes. You stop expanding, you stop over-explaining, you stop trying to impress. You move to escalation testing or termination, because continuation without ownership is drift. And this is where discipline separates professionals from the performers. See, performers enjoy the conversation. Professionals evaluate its structure. And from here, we go deeper, because not all non-decision interactions are equal. Some are bridges and some are absorbers. If you can't tell the difference, you will sit in the loop for months. Not everyone who lacks decision authority is a problem, but everyone who lacks decision authority must be categorized. Now, there are 3 common roles that you're going to encounter: proxies, screeners, and information gatherers. They look similar on the surface, but structurally they all behave differently. So let's define each one of them. A proxy is someone intentionally positioned between you and the decision maker. Their job is to evaluate whether escalation is justified. They may be instructed to either filter, or they may be trusted to assess the situation. They may have some sort of influence, but they do not carry the final risk. See, a screener is process driven. They're not evaluating the idea, but they are protecting time. They follow protocol. They don't care about substance yet. They care about whether you fit certain criteria. And lastly, an information gatherer is purely exploratory. They just want to understand. They may be curious, they may even be enthusiastic, but they are not accountable for the outcome. Now, here's the critical distinction. A bridge proxy wants clarity. An absorber proxy wants information. Okay? A bridge moves you upward, but an absorber just keeps you occupied. So how do you tell the difference? You need to listen for ownership language. So a bridge will say things like, if this makes sense, I can bring you to, or we should get you in front of, or this would need to be discussed with. See, this is upward direction. This is defined escalation. There is a structure. An absorber says, send me more details. I'll circulate this. We're still evaluating options. Notice what's missing. There's no name, no time, and no commitment to any sort of escalation. See, absorbers are comfortable staying in motion without any sort of resolution. And if you stay with them too long, you become part of their process, not part of the outcome. Now, here's the mistake that most people make. They think if I just provide enough clarity, they'll push it upward. Maybe, but you don't control that. And authority does not rely on hope. Authority tests structures, and you get one escalation test. You determine whether upward movement is structurally possible. If the person responds with clarity, they are your bridge. If they respond with vagueness, they are an absorber. Once identified, your behavior changes. See, with a bridge, you stay concise and transition. With an absorber, you do not expand. You do not overinvest. You resolve or exit. See, the danger of absorbers is psychological. They make you feel like you're advancing. You receive the positive signals. You receive the thoughtful questions. You receive polite engagement, but then you mistake that for movement. Because movement without ownership is just an illusion. Ownership is the only thing that matters. Now, let's be disciplined here. You are not judging people. You are categorizing structure. This is not emotional. The moment that you detect absorption without escalation, your posture tightens up. You compress, and you test. And if structure doesn't appear, you terminate. Because staying in non-decisive environments weakens your tone over time. You start sounding like someone trying to get something approved, and that shifts the perception. You are not there to get approved. You are there to determine the alignment, and that difference is everything. There is one sentence that kills more momentum than direct rejection ever will. Yeah, sure, go ahead. Just send me some information. It sounds harmless. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like interest. It's often none of those things. Information requests are not decisions. They are deferrals. And deferrals feel safe. They reduce the tension. They postpone the resolution. They allow parties to exit the moment without some sort of discomfort. And that's why they're so common. But here's the structural problem with that. When someone asks for information without defining escalation, they're doing one of 3 things. They are either buying time, avoiding ownership, or absorbing content without commitment. If you respond by immediately expanding, explaining, and sending materials, you've automatically accepted the frame. You've agreed to stay in motion without structure. Now you're stuck waiting on a loading screen while the level loads. And waiting weakens posture. So let's break this down clearly. Information is only valuable if it moves the structure forward. If there is no defined next step tied to that information, it becomes noise. Most amateurs think if I just send something compelling enough, they're going to move. Maybe. But now you're dependent on an asynchronous persuasion tactic. An asynchronous persuasion removes your leverage because you are not present to enforce clarity. Now, when you hear send me info, you don't expand. You don't immediately comply. You clarify once, and you determine whether information is tied to escalation. If it is, it becomes structured. If it isn't, it is a loop. And loops look like this. You send materials, they review, they disappear. You follow up, they say they're still reviewing, weeks pass, and nothing moves. And that's because you never enforced a fork in the road. You don't know whether it died or whether it drifted. And that ambiguity is expensive. Clean systems do not allow ambiguity. If information is requested, it must serve one of two functions: bridge upward or resolve downward. If it does neither of those things, all you're doing is feeding absorption. Now let's address the ego, because people comply with send me info because they fear losing the interaction. They think refusing to send something makes them look unhelpful. But the truth is, blind compliance makes your status lower because it signals that you control the pace and I will respond. You see, authority controls the pace. Authority does not chase review cycles. Authority either escalates or exits. Now be careful here. This is not about refusing to send information. It's about refusing to send information without structure. So structure means you have a defined recipient, a defined timeline, a defined next interaction, and most importantly, definement of exactly what you're sending. What is actually information? And if those are absent, you're not advancing, you're just extending. An extension without direction is just drift. So here's the rule. If someone wants information, it must connect to some sort of decision. If it doesn't, you compress the interaction towards clarity. If clarity does not appear, you close the loop. Not emotionally, not defensively, just cleanly. Because endless review is not progress. It is delay disguised as professionalism. Now, I've said this multiple times, but now we're going to actually define what escalate once or terminate cleanly means. If you have identified a non-decision environment, you have either detected a proxy, a screener, an absorber, or a semi-info loop. Now comes the moment that defines you. Escalate once or terminate cleanly. Not twice, not 3 times, not with variations, just once. But why once? Because the first escalation tests the structure. The second escalation tests ego. If you push again after structure has been revealed as weak, you are no longer operating, you are persuading. And persuasion in a non-decision environment creates resistance. And here's what escalation actually means inside of this system. Escalation means clarifying whether upward movement exists. You're not pitching, you're not arguing, you're not convincing, you're just clarifying. If upward movement is available, it will reveal itself quickly. If it is vague, delayed, or avoided, that is your answer as well. See, most amateurs don't want that answer. They think maybe if they just have more context. No problem, I'll explain further. Well, let me just clarify one more thing. That is attachment to the outcome. And attachment leaks into your tone. You start sounding invested and desperate. Invested in continuation. Desperate to talk to someone. But continuation without ownership is just drift. Now, let's talk about termination. Now, termination is not dramatic, it's not cold, it's not emotional. It is simply a resolution. You acknowledge structure as it is, and you exit. No lingering, no half-open doors, no just checking in, no follow-up loops unless structure clearly warrants it. Clean termination does something powerful. You see, it restores control over time. It signals non-attachment. It differentiates you from people who chase approval. Now, here's something counterintuitive. Sometimes escalation happens after termination. Not because you pushed, but because you didn't. See, when you exit without emotional residue, you alter their perception. You become someone who evaluates fit, not someone who seeks some sort of validation. And evaluators are treated differently than seekers. But you cannot exit hoping for that. If you exit hoping it triggers some sort of escalation, you are still attached. Termination must be genuine. This module is simple. Non-decision interactions are identified quickly. Escalation is tested once, and if viable, you transition. If not, you exit. That is discipline. That is structure. That is how you prevent months of wasted motion. See, most people stay in false progress because they fear ending things. Professionals end things to preserve strength. When someone is busy, most people take that personally. They assume that they're not interested, this is bad timing, I'm interrupting, or I should leave. And now sometimes that's true. Oftentimes, it's not. Busyness is a condition. Rejection is a decision. Most people confuse the two. And when you confuse them, you react emotionally instead of structurally. Now let's define busyness clearly. So busyness looks like short responses, interruptions, background noise, multitasking. None of those equal rejection, they equal context. Now here's where most amateurs break. They interpret busyness as hostility. So they rush. They compress too aggressively. They over-apologize. Or they withdraw prematurely. All of those behaviors leak insecurity. When someone is busy, your job is not to win attention. It's to test the viability. There's a difference. Winning attention requires you to be a performer. Testing viability requires structure. Here's that internal shift for you. You're not trying to be accommodated. You're determining whether continuation makes sense in this moment. If someone is busy but engaged, the structure can still move. If someone is busy and dismissive, the structure ends. But you don't decide that emotionally. You observe. Busyness creates noise, and noise requires calmness. If you raise your energy to compete with that noise, you lose. If you lower your pace and remain contained, you stand out. See, in chaotic environments, stillness becomes amplified. People subconsciously gravitate towards the least reactive person in the room. That can be you. Now let's address a mistake. Some people try to push through the busyness. They speak louder, they speak faster, they try to overpower the environment. And that triggers resistance. Because now you are increasing the cognitive load of the person that you're talking to. The rule is simple. If busyness exists, compress. Don't pitch, just compress. Short statements, clear relevance, then evaluate the response. If attention stabilizes, continue. If the tension does not stabilize, you exit. Cleanly, not apologetically, not resentfully, just cleanly. Busyness is not an obstacle, it's a filter. And it reveals whether your presence creates some clarity or friction. If you can remain stable in a busy environment, you're going to gain authority instantly because you are not reactive, you are structured. But here's something subtle. Sometimes busyness is used as a shield. People say they're busy because they want to avoid discomfort. And if that's the case, escalation will not appear. You test once, and if structure does not form, you exit. Again, not emotionally, structurally. The key principle here is this. Do not interpret busyness, you test it. Interpretation is emotional, testing is operational. When time shrinks, the structure must tighten. See, most people respond to time pressure in one of two ways. They either rush or they retreat. Both are wrong. See, rushing sounds like urgency, and retreating sounds like insecurity. Compression is neither of those things. Compression is clarity without any sort of expansion. So let's define time pressure. Time pressure sounds like I only have a minute, make it quick, I'm heading into something, or I'm tight on time. Those are not rejections, those are just constraints. And constraints require discipline. When someone says they have a limited amount of time, amateurs usually panic internally. They think, I have to get everything out. I need to be compelling. I can't miss this window. So they speed up. They stack points. They explain more than necessary. They try to condense their entire pitch into one singular burst of energy. And that just creates an overwhelming situation. Overwhelming situations create shutdown. Compression is different. Compression removes the excess. It does not increase the speed. You speak slower, not faster. You just reduce the amount of content. And you deliver one clear, relevant statement, and you stop. Stopping is the hardest part because stopping transfers that responsibility from you to the prospect. If you keep speaking, you are the one carrying the pressure. If you stop, they must respond. Under time pressure, this matters even more because the moment you keep talking past their declared limit, you communicate disrespect for that constraint. Constraint is real. Respecting it increases credibility. Ignoring it decreases trust. Now let's be precise here. Compression does not mean oversimplification. All it means is prioritization. What is the single most relevant element? What is the single fork in the road? What is the single test that determines continuation? That is all that gets spoken. See, most people try to earn more time. They say just one more thing before you go, and those phrases reveal attachment. Attachment makes you sound like someone trying to hold attention. Authority does not cling to the attention. Authority respects the constraint. Now here's the operational rule. When time pressure appears, deliver one structured statement and pause. If engagement increases, you continue on. If engagement remains low, exit. There's no stacking, no persuasion burst. Compression creates weight. Weight is created by restraint. See, people under time pressure do not want more information. They want utter clarity. And if you deliver clarity without urgency, you stand out immediately because you are not reacting to their constraint. You're operating within it. Time pressure is not a threat. It is an amplifier. It amplifies the instability, or it amplifies the structure. Your job is to remain the least reactive person in the exchange. See, not every interaction deserves a continuation. And under disruption, this becomes very clear very quickly. After you compress under time pressure, one thing must happen. Attention will either stabilize or it doesn't. See, stabilizing attention looks like an eye contact increase. Their body movement slows. Their responses become complete instead of fragmented. The other person asks something intentional, and you can feel it. The energy shifts from that scattered brain to focus. That is permission to continue. See, most people don't wait for stabilization, they assume it. They keep talking even when the attention is split. They continue presenting while the other person checks their phone, types on their laptop, speaks to someone else in the room, walks away mid-sentence. That is not engagement, that is tolerance. Now, tolerance is not alignment. If attention does not stabilize after compression, you exit. Not because you're offended, but because structure requires presence. Presence requires attention. If someone cannot allocate attention, they cannot allocate a decision. And if a decision cannot exist, continuation has no value. You see, most amateurs fear walking away. They think this might be my only shot. I should push through. If I leave now, it's over. But pushing through fractures the attention and lowers your status because you are now competing for cognitive bandwidth. Authority does not compete for attention, it requires it. See, walking away is not dramatic, it is calm, it is neutral, and it is final. For example, I see you have a lot on your plate right now. Let's revisit this at a better time when you don't have as much going on. You acknowledge the constraint and you end it cleanly. And you leave without resentment. That emotional neutrality is critical. If you leave frustrated, you leak insecurity. If you leave apologetically, you lower your frame. You leave balanced. Now here's something important. Walking away increases your attention because most people expect you to chase. And when you don't, that perception shifts. But you cannot exit hoping for that effect. That would be manipulation. You exit because structure isn't present. Nothing more. This lesson is simple. Compression tests viability. Stabilization determines continuation. No stabilization means termination. And that discipline protects your tone, it protects your posture, and it protects your time. See, most people obsess over how to start, and almost no one studies how to end. And that is a mistake, because entry sets the tone, your exit defines your perception. You can enter perfectly, calm, structured, clear, concise, but if you leave poorly, everything you just built dissolves. See, the final moments of an interaction are what people remember most. Not the middle, not the opening, but the end. And endings reveal truth. See, when something doesn't move forward, your exit tells the other person one thing. Are you attached or are you structured? See, most amateurs are attached. You hear it in their voice. They hesitate, they soften, they leave doors open. They over-explain while they're ending it. They say, maybe later, let's stay in touch, feel free to reach out anytime. Now, those phrases sound harmless, but they signal one thing. I still want this. And the moment you signal you want something without alignment, you lose leverage. Authority does not cling. Authority concludes. Now, here's something important. A clean exit does not mean coldness. It just means completion. And completion reduces tension. When you exit cleanly, you create clarity. And clarity builds respect, even when the answer is no. Now let's define why the exit matters more than the entry. Entry tests relevance. Your exit demonstrates strength. See, anyone can speak confidently at the start, but few can walk away calmly at the end, especially when continuation feels possible. But discipline shows most clearly at the moment of loss. If something does not move forward and you push again or add one more angle or try to recover, you reveal attachment. And attachment lowers status instantly. But if you say calmly, hey, this doesn't appear to be aligned right now. Understood? No problem. And you stop, you demonstrate control. Control over emotion, over the outcome, and over yourself. And control over yourself is what authority actually is. Because here's the paradox. When you exit cleanly, you increase the chance of future engagement. Not because you manipulated it, but because you didn't chase it. People remember your composure. They forget the pressure. And if you want to understand authority at a deep level, understand this. The ability to end an interaction without emotional residue is very rare. Most people carry it with them. They replay it. They justify it. They wish it went differently. Operators close it, and then they move. And from this point forward, do not measure your skill by how well you enter. Measure it by how cleanly you leave. Because the exit is where attachment is exposed. Now, the earlier lessons gave you the exit criteria, the ladder, and the structure. When to disqualify and how to do it cleanly. This lesson is not about the triggers. It's about the final 10 seconds. The part that most people unknowingly ruin. So you can correctly follow the exit rule and still lose status if your tone, pacing, or language leaks attachment. You see, not all exits are the same, but all clean exits share one trait: emotional neutrality. See, most people think exits are either aggressive or submissive. That is wrong. There are 3 discipline exit types in this system: neutral, respectful, and final. Each serves a different structural condition, and each one is conditionally based on what is happening in real time. So a neutral exit is used when the alignment is unclear, the interest is low but it's not hostile, and the structure does not justify continuation. So neutrality means there's no pressure, no apology, no emotional spike. It sounds calm, balanced, and unbothered, and you acknowledge the structure, you close the interaction, and you move. No lingering, no vague, just checking in. The neutral exits preserve optionality without chasing it. They communicate the confidence through restraint. And if there is a structured re-entry path, it is stated clearly. If it's not, you simply stop. Then you have the respectful exit. A respectful exit is used when the other person has been engaged, but the timing or priority is genuinely misaligned. There's no hostility there, it's just a mismatch. Respectful means you acknowledge their position, you do not challenge it, and you do not attempt to reframe it. You recognize the constraint and you close it out cleanly. Now the tone here is steady. It's not warm, it's not cold, just steady. Respectful exits maintain dignity on both sides. They prevent ego flare-ups, it prevents the tension escalation, and it leaves the interaction completed. Now, if there's a conditional door appropriate here, it is going to be procedural, not emotional. Then you have your final exit. Now, a final exit is used when there's been multiple explicit rejections, there's multiple repeated deferrals, and there is a structural dead end. Final means there's no future reframing, no nurture suggestions, no subtle re-entry angles. You close the door calmly. And this is where most people fail. They cannot resist adding one more sentence, one more angle, one more just in case. And that extra sentence destroys the finality of it. Because without finality, you invite drift. Clarity creates strength, even when the answer is no. Now, the hardest part of the exit is not the words. It's the internal detachment. If you are exiting while hoping they reverse themselves, you are not exiting. If you are exiting while feeling rejected, you are not neutral. And if you are exiting while trying to protect your ego, your tone will leak it. See, clean exits require emotional control. You must be comfortable with no outcome, no continuation, and no validation. Most people cannot tolerate that. So they extend the interactions artificially. They chase the soft signals. They create endless follow-up loops that lead to nothing. And every loop lowers their perceived strength. See, if continuation is not justified by structure, end it. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just simply end it. Because how you leave determines how you are remembered. People rarely remember what you said. They remember how you made them feel. And a composed exit is rare, and rare behavior stands out. See, a composed exit is rare, and a rare behavior stands out. See, most people misuse the nurture portion of this system. They call it a strategy, but it's usually just avoidance. Let's define this cleanly. There are only 2 reasons an interaction does not continue: and structural misalignment or a timing misalignment. Structural misalignments mean they don't have the authority, they don't have interest, they don't have priority, It's just not aligned. Timing misalignment means they have the authority, they have the alignment, they have the potential, but external timing prevents movement. Nurturing is only valid for timing misalignment. A close-off is required for a structural misalignment. And if you confuse those two, you'll live in the follow-up loops. So what does a close mean? The path is not viable under current structuring. So for example, we handle this internally. No authority, no escalation path. There's a repeated deferral without structure and a pattern of avoidance. Now, closing it off does not mean emotional rejection. It just means a structural dead end. And when the structure is dead, you stop. There's no nurturing, no slow drip, no checking in, because nurture without structure is just self-deception. Now, into nurturing. Nurturing is valid when the right person is identified, the authority is confirmed, the alignment exists, but the only real blocker is the timing of things. So for example, like the budget cycle next quarter, the internal project currently consuming bandwidth, a specific milestone must happen first, a clear not now, not interested. See, nurturing requires a defined re-entry window, not a vague let's reconnect sometime, specifically after X milestone or next quarter or in 30 days once this is resolved. If the re-entry trigger is unclear, it is not a nurture, it's just drift. Now, the hard rule of this is if you cannot clearly articulate who owns the decision, what the blocker is, and when re-entry happens, you do not nurture, you just close. See, most people nurture because they fear losing optionality. But false optionality is just a weakness. Authority respects that clarity, and closing does not burn bridges, it just protects your time. And paradoxically, again, clean closes often end up reopening later because you did not chase. Nurturing is strategic. Both are strong when used correctly. Both are weak when used emotionally. From this point forward, you do not ask, should I keep following up? You ask, is this structural or timing? If it's structural, you close it out. If it's timing with defined trigger, you nurture. If neither of those is clear, you close. Clarity over comfort, always. Now, one of the most important things with the exit is not how you exit, but it's when you exit. Most people wait too long. They hesitate. They give one more explanation, one more example, one more attempt to salvage some sort of momentum. And that delay is where your authority erodes. You see, exit timing is not emotional. It's purely structural. You exit the moment continuation is no longer justified. Not when it becomes awkward, not when you feel rejected, not when the conversation just fully collapses. The moment the structure disappears. Now let's define that precisely. Structure disappears when escalation is blocked or when your tension does not stabilize, when you have repeat deferrals without clarity. The second that pattern becomes clear, hesitation must stop. See, most people hesitate because they fear finality. They think maybe if I wait a little longer, maybe if I try once more. That thought is the attachment. And attachment leaks into your tone immediately. You start sounding hopeful or slightly uncertain. You start sounding invested in the continuation. You see, and the other person always feels that shift. And once they feel it, the power moves from you to them. Now you are trying to hold something together instead of evaluating it like a professional. See, the discipline is you don't wait for the collapse. You don't wait for the awkwardness. You exit at the first clear structural break. Now that timing will signal a few things. The most important thing it signals is confidence because it says, I understand how this works. It also protects your posture because the longer you stay in a misaligned interaction, the more that your tone is going to degrade. You're going to become slightly faster, more animated, more persuasive. Small leaks, but noticeable. You see, early exits preserve your composure. Those late exits reveal the need. Now, let's address something a bit more subtle. Exiting too early can also be a weakness. If the escalation is viable but uncomfortable, you leave to avoid tension. That is not discipline, that is avoidance. You see, timing requires clarity. You must distinguish between a structural dead end and an emotional discomfort. You see, discomfort is not a reason to exit. Structural misalignment is. And the key question here is simple. Is forward movement possible here? If yes, stay structured. If no, close cleanly. Authority is often measured in seconds. In those small moments where people linger, that is where the strength is demonstrated. When you end at the correct moment, you control the narrative. And when you stay past it, you surrender the narrative. Drift does not feel like failure. It feels like a conversation. It feels like engagement. It feels like we're just working through it. And that's what makes it so dangerous. You see, drift is the slow departure from structure, not because the other person has forced it, but because you allowed it. And it happens quietly. Now let's define drift clearly. Drift begins the moment you stop enforcing one of the three outcomes: either advance, disqualify, or close the loop. If you cannot identify which outcome the interaction is heading towards, you are drifting. Now, drift has early indicators, and if you catch them early, you can correct instantly. If you miss them, you're going to enter loops. So here are the primary signals. First, you start explaining more than necessary, not because they asked for it, but because you felt tension. And that tension then triggered expansion. And expansion without structure is drift. Secondly, you stop asking the structural questions. You move into exploration, you discuss hypotheticals, you entertain possibilities without narrowing. Exploration without escalation is drift. Thirdly, you begin managing emotion. You begin softening your tone. You overvalidate, you reassure, you laugh unnecessarily. Emotion management signals that you validate comfort over clarity. That is drift. Fourth, you lose track of ownership. You forget who carries the risk. You forget who can decide. You continue the interaction without confirming the authority. That is drift. Fifth, you stay after the structure breaks. Escalation fails. Attention fragments. Deferrals repeat. But you continue talking. That is drift. You see, in each one of these examples, you see that drift always starts small. One extra sentence. One unnecessary clarification. One softened exit. One, let me just... And once drift begins, it compounds. Because the longer you remain in misalignment, the more attached you become. See, drift feels safer than resolution because resolution creates tension. Drift maintains that comfort. And most people unconsciously choose comfort. You must choose structure instead. See, the moment you sense drift, you have two options: either re-anchor or exit. See, re-anchoring means returning to the structure. You're clarifying the escalation. You're clarifying the next step. And if structure cannot be restored quickly, you exit. No frustration, just a clean resolution. Now, here's your internal diagnostic question. What outcome is this moving towards? If you cannot answer that in one sentence, you're drifting. And the longer you drift, the weaker your signal becomes. See, professionals detect that drift early. Amateurs end up detecting it when it's already too late. Your job is not to avoid drift entirely, it's to catch it. See, correction speed determines the authority. It's to catch it. Your correction speed determines your authority. Now, there will be moments where you feel it. Your tone is shifting, your pace is accelerating, you're slightly chasing. You know it, and that's the moment most people end up doubling down. They try to recover midstream. They try to reframe or regain posture. And that rarely works. Because once emotional drift passes a threshold, recovery attempts end up looking artificial. The interaction already tilted, and this is where forced exit exists. A forced exit is not about the other person, it's about you. You're exiting not because the structure collapsed externally, you're exiting because discipline weakened internally. And most people don't have this rule. They stay in conversations too long because they try to salvage the ego, the momentum, and they try to prove something. And that ends up compounding the damage. If you feel attachment rising past control, end it. If you feel frustration affecting your tone, end it. If you feel the need to prove yourself, end it. And if you feel yourself chasing, end it. Do not explain why you're ending it. You don't blame timing. You don't justify the exit. You simply close. Because authority lost slowly is harder to rebuild than an opportunity lost quickly. So let's define that threshold. You are allowed one structural correction. You are allowed one structural correction attempt. If drift continues, force an exit. You are allowed one escalation test. If it fails and you feel an ego spike, force an exit. You are allowed one compression under chaos. If attention does not stabilize and you feel yourself pushing, force an exit. You see, forced exits protect your reputation because people remember your last state. If your last state is reactive, that's what they retain. If your last state is composed, that's what they retain. You will lose some opportunities because of forced exits. That's good because it's better to lose an opportunity than to lose posture. Because posture compounds across interactions. Chasing once weakens the next 5 interactions, but clean exits strengthen your next 5 interactions. And this rule removes your ego from the equation. You're not there to win every single interaction. You are there to preserve your authority across all interactions. And if you cannot hold internal neutrality, you leave. Not as a retreat, but as a reset. See, resets are strength. Most people stay too long because they fear missing out. Operators leave early to protect signal, because signal is more valuable than a single outcome. This lesson is going to give you a scorecard. See, most people evaluate their interactions emotionally. How did that feel? Did I do well? Were they receptive? Those are absolutely useless metrics. You do not grade yourself on vibe. You grade yourself on structure. A post-interaction audit is not a reflection. It's a mechanical review. Immediately after an interaction ends, you ask 4 questions. You're not storytelling. You're not justifying. You're not adding emotional commentary, just structure. The first question is, what state was I in? Was this access, false progress, disruption, finality, or internal drift? And if you cannot identify the state, you are operating unconsciously. And that is a problem because every interaction must be categorized. Uncategorized interactions is where drift hides. Secondly, did it end in one of the 3 outcomes? So either advance, disqualify, or close the loop. If it ended in let's see, maybe, we'll talk, or I'll think about it, without that structure, you failed the system. Even if it felt positive, positive drift is still drift. The third question, where did I almost break? Now, this is the most important question. Were there any spots where you over-explained or laughed unnecessarily or added 1 extra sentence on your exit? Or did you stay longer than the structure justified? Don't judge it, just log it. Because what you're learning here is pattern awareness. And having that prevents repetition. Fourthly, was my exit clean? You need to be ruthless here. So did you add maybe later or let me know or I'll check back? Did you linger? If any of those are yes, you didn't close cleanly. You extended. And extensions are weaknesses. Now, the rule here is you do not carry emotional residue into the next interaction. If the audit reveals leakage, you reset immediately. Slow your breathing down. Re-anchor your posture. Re-anchor your tone and re-anchor your pace. Never let one unstable interaction infect the next one. If you've ever seen dominoes and you kick one over, it continues down the line until there is a domino that it cannot hit, and that removes the domino effect. You have to become that removed domino and not allow one unstable interaction to infect the next one. See, most amateurs spiral because they don't audit without becoming a domino. They just replay it emotionally. They justify, they self-soothe, they self-criticize. None of that builds control. Operators review the structure, then move. Now, this matters because without an audit, your drift is going to compound silently. With audits, your corrections become immediately. With audits, your corrections become immediate. And correction speed determines authority. See, the goal here is not perfection. The goal is shorter recovery cycles. The faster that you detect deviation, the stronger your signal becomes long-term. Now the system is protected. You know when to exit. You know what to not say. You know how drift begins. You know how motion leaks. You know when to force your exit, and you know how to audit yourself after.